Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is a special topical intelligence update for the seemingly imminent Ukrainian war for Friday the 21st of January 2022. As always, this brief is being recorded the day prior on the 20th of January. Let's start by covering some international events that have taken place in Europe over the past 24 to 48 hours. The larger one that actually occurred a couple of weeks ago but is rapidly becoming more of a pressing issue is the submarine cable that has been cut between the mainland of Norway and the Svalbard archipelago. So for those of you who don't understand what the significance of this is, 99% of all communications on planet Earth take place over undersea cables. Quite literally very large cables that are strung between nations, between continents that actually carry information. These cables serve as a vital link of information from country to country and serve as really a basis for the internet as we know it. We can't really send information from one place to another quickly via wireless methods such as satellites, so we have to rely on these what are essentially bottlenecks in the form of submarine or undersea cables. And just a couple of weeks ago, Norway found out that one of their cables between the mainland of Norway and the Svalbard archipelago was cut. This cable was of somewhat military nature. It was really for their satellite communications network, for their space program and things like that, but I'm sure it also had a military use. They used this cable to send and receive information from that massive satellite communications facility. Now, I should mention this in the context of the Ukrainian conflict because this is a very significant event. Russia, since the end of the Cold War, has really looked at different ways of asserting power and dominance over the Western world, as one might expect, in a post-nuclear age. Meaning that Russia has nukes, the United States has nukes, we're set on the nuclear front, but Russia has spent a very large part of their military, their naval budget, to create a special directorate which is meant to map and tap and destroy undersea cables. This is evidenced by their naval efforts and their submarine technologies over the past few decades, but as of late, we're starting to see a lot more of this technology come into the open. And Russia has made it a significant part of their naval mission to conduct intelligence operations on a lot of these cables that are on the seafloor, either quite literally sending a little mini submarine down from a larger submarine to grab on with little mechanical arms to grab onto these cables and quite literally drill into them to try to tap the information. So there's an intelligence gathering thing. Russia also recognizing that the majority of internet traffic goes through these cables in a wartime setting, their mission would be to not just to tap these cables to try to get the information that's in them, but try to destroy the cables, effectively decapitating most military communications and civilian communications without ever firing a shot. This is a big deal for Europe as well as the rest of the world, the United States as well. Russia themselves do not have a very large need for submarine cables, for undersea cables, because Russia is, of course, the largest nation on the planet. They span, 12 time zones or something like that. So they have a large landmass with which to send and receive information from one side of their empire to another. And almost all of Russia's allies border Russia themselves, so it's quite an easy, a little bit easier for Russia to have a solid communications infrastructure, whereas the United States, Europe, the United Kingdom, places like that have to rely on these undersea cables to maintain communications. So the reason that this submarine cable being cut is a big deal is that we don't know if this has ever happened before. We know that the Russians we've got pretty solid concrete evidence that the Russians have successfully, or at least tried to tap undersea cables before. We've got evidence of that. That's become public knowledge lately. We know that they map things. We know they practice trying to set explosives on these cables to sever them. But we don't know if I can't personally think of any case where a cable has actually been severed intentionally. And a Norwegian shipping, or rather a cable laying company, who, of course, once again, Once this cable was cut, they sent a repair team out, and the repair team discovered that it had been very deliberately cut. So we here, in our very, very limited intelligence picture of the geopolitical sphere, right, we think that this is probably a warning to Europe. Essentially, Russia saying, hey, don't mess with us in Ukraine, let us do what we got to do in Ukraine, and we won't cut any more of your cables. This sounds very much like something Putin would do. It sounds very much like the senior military leadership, like Lavrov would say. This sounds very much like Russian doctrine at this point, but again, this is very much speculation. But I did want to bring this up because a submarine cable, an undersea cable being cut, is a very, very significant event that we need to pay attention to. The other big bit of news has been the significant Russian naval activity over the past 24 to 48 hours. A large flotilla of Russian landing craft and amphibious assault ships has left port in the Baltic Sea with the destination unknown technically, but presumably the Black Sea. So far, the ships are as follows: the Minsk, the Kaliningrad, the Korolev, the Olenegorsk Gornyak, the Georgy Pobedonosets, and the Peter Morganov have left port and are, again, like I mentioned, presumably headed to the Black Sea. The first three ships make up the bulk of the Baltic Sea fleet when it comes to their amphibious assault craft, and the other three ships are much older craft, but still capable, that are on loan from the North Sea fleet. Moving on to Sweden, this is something that might be unrelated, but it might also be a very significant, again, threat to the rest of Europe, is that Sweden has observed several significant unmanned aerial vehicles in the vicinity of several of their nuclear power plants as of the past day or so. This is something that is currently being investigated. No one's really quite sure what's going on, but again, with all of this significant military activity within Europe, it's really something that should be noted. Additionally, the three nations of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have been offering weapons to Ukraine. They just need to get through their various political systems to, sign the bottom line to make sure that happens. Again, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia coming to Ukraine's aid in the form of military shipments. They're probably not going to be able to offer very much, but a lot of European nations are stepping up to supply Ukraine with military arms if they cannot provide troops for their defense. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Germany has refused all aid to Ukraine. They're not giving them any weapons whatsoever, and it's very much Germany has slammed the door in Ukraine's face when it comes to military equipment. Also, relations between Poland and Ukraine are not super great right now. Historically, Poland and Ukraine have not really gotten along so well, as one might expect due to the fallout from the Cold War and that, decades of back and forth on that. But recently, as in the past couple of days, there has been a significant problem on the border with regards to rail logistics. So both Poland and Ukraine have been trading accusations at each other over this. Poland states that, or accuses Ukraine of stopping all train traffic, rail traffic from Ukraine into Poland, all trade, shutting it all down, and that hurting the Polish economy. Well, the Ukraine has stated that Poland has not abided by their agreements when it comes to trade and things like that. So it's really hard to tell who started this, but there's a little bit of a spat when it comes to rail logistics between Poland and Ukraine. Now, this matters because Poland's got to be sweating right now. I'm sure that their military forces have deployed quietly a lot of troops to the Ukrainian border because essentially if Russia invades Ukraine, depending on how far Russia goes, Poland might be the last bastion. Ukraine is definitely the only thing keeping Russia off Poland's border, and that's got to be upsetting Poland quite a bit. Likewise, rail problems. If there are rail logistical problems, if Ukraine has stopped shipments into Poland, if that is true, that means that the rail logistics are undergoing some kind of upset, right? And this is going to be a huge problem for anyone trying to egress from Ukraine, during this war that's, many people, ourselves included, think is about to break out. So for those people who are in Ukraine and think, oh, well, I'll just hop on a train to Poland, well, you might not be able to because of the railway congestion due to this little diplomatic spat between the countries. So again, this that might be a remote possibility. Don't really know, but again, logistics is one of those things that people often forget or discount in times of conflict, and this could be a very big problem in the future. I also wanted to touch on Kazakhstan for a minute. The Russian deployment to Kazakhstan has come to an end, and the airborne troops that took part in that are now being relocated either around Russia or into Belarus or places like that. For those of you who weren't following the Kazakhstan event, it was basically over as soon as it started. There was a small coup that occurred in Kazakhstan. The dictator was attempted to be overthrown by a smaller contingent of politicians and things like that. And the coup was put down with the aid of Russian airborne troops and other forces that came to Kazakhstan's aid to help quell that rebellion. Kazakhstan's had a dictator-style relationship in the political sphere in Kazakhstan for a while now, so it's not surprising, but this for sure did one of two things for Russia. One, it allowed their airborne troops to again get one last little training exercise with live rounds, if you know what I mean, for airborne operations. But it also maybe pushed back the timeline that Russia had for invading Ukraine, if that is in fact what they're going to do. Yeah, the airborne units, the Russian airborne, is going to be very, very much needed when it comes to securing key locations like airfields, as well as the assault for Kiev here in a minute. So that's really all I've got for significant events outside of Ukraine. Let's go ahead and take a look at some reference material that we're going to need to know when this conflict kicks off. And that is the composition of the standard Russian battalion tactical group. The BTG concept was created much for the same reasons that the United States BCT, or Brigade Combat Team, was created for regional conflicts around the world. Russia has historically not been super great when it comes to expeditionary things. So unlike the United States military, whose main goal has been expeditionary ventures, Russia has really not structured their military around that so much. But we can talk more about Russian military doctrine later. Really what I wanted to focus on is some terms and graphics for specifically the BTG, because the BTG is what we're going to be talking about a lot. This is the main style of unit that is being used that has been used and will continue to be used in Ukraine if this conflict gets any more kinetic than it already has. So let's go over what exactly a BTG is, and what kinds of units, subunits, are inside one, right? So, symbology for a battalion tactical group, BTG. It's a smaller style unit. It's not really the upper echelons and organizational structure for BTGs is very interesting. Russia likes to use these BTGs in very small areas, independent of one another. So, rather than deploying entire regiments or corps or armies around Russia, they prefer to cherry pick BTGs from all over the Russian Federation and send them to a specific area to work together. So it's more of I don't really know how to describe it other than maybe it's a little bit more autonomous than the traditional Russian style of command structure, but essentially this is supposed to be the Swiss Army knife of Russian military units. So within a battalion tactical group, within a BTG, the main meat and potatoes is the motor rifle company. In other words, mechanized infantry. So one motor rifle company consists of usually 2 motor rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. Now the weapons platoon can of course be anything from heavy weapons to some kind of towed weaponry that we can get into in a minute. This can vary quite a bit, right? But usually this is the basic composition, and there are usually 3 of these motor rifle companies per BTG. Up next is artillery. So this is a very significant part of the battalion tactical group. They not only have their mechanized infantry, but they also have artillery on board to handle any kind of support actions for those infantry. And this is a very significant part. Most Russian artillery is in the form of rocket artillery, but the BTGs have been observed to be using 122 millimeter self-propelled howitzers as their main force for BTGs. Again, like I mentioned, this can be swapped out, so we can have a lot of MRLS or multiple rocket launcher systems being used in lieu of the normal howitzers that we might see, but for the most part, again, this is the basic complement. Within the artillery battery, there's also a specific mortar platoon, and then also, again, a couple of platoons of towed guns. Now, again, in the Russian military doctrine, they have a very long history with sort of anti-tank guns and towed guns and things like that. These can be mounted, so we might see some kind of track-based guns. We might see the normal towed guns towed behind like a normal truck. Usually the Russians like to have these in direct fire mode, so we're talking like anti-tank guns that are being used in direct fire mode in an anti-tank role, but these also can function in an indirect fire role, so for engaging targets at a longer distance. Up next, we have various different kinds of platoons that kind of fall underneath the structure, and they can go wherever they're needed. First up is recon. So, again, one of the downsides of the BTG is that it doesn't really have the ability to project power beyond its own footprint so much. But they do have a very small reconnaissance effort organic to the BTG, so that's interesting. Also, they have an ASG-17 platoon. Typically, for those that don't understand what that is, that's typically like an automatic grenade launcher platoon, similar to the U.S. Mark 19. Also, the Russians, again, have a very long history of using flame projection platoons. Usually these are rocket-based or rocket-propelled flamethrowers. Some weaponry that is, again, unique to the Russian military doctrine. We don't really tend to use that so much in the U.S. Doctrine anymore, but again, the Russians do use that. And again, they also have a specific, the Russian doctrine calls it a machine gun platoon, but think of this as your weapons platoon again, just taking into account various different kinds of weaponry that can either be dismounted or mounted. So again, these guys all kind of work together. They're not really going to be operating so much as an independent platoon for different things. And then finally, a very small ADA detachment. We're talking maybe a couple of dudes with some SA-7s, so some man pads, just for localized, very short-range air defense. And then finally, we have various support functions. We have signals, supply, engineers, maintainers, and medical. So again, just like very, very much similar to a Western-style structure with regards to the support functions. So that is the basic structure of a battalion tactical group as used by Russia in the recent times. Like I mentioned, again, this can vary so much. This will vary widely when it comes to support units and what other units are going to be working in conjunction with various BTGs to accomplish their mission. Some BTGs will get an extra Grad-style MRLS system. We might see trench diggers being used. We've already seen pictures of those being attached to various BTGs. We might even see a BTG get thrown in with an electronic warfare outfit or a very large high-level, high-altitude SAM site, or even maybe a ballistic missile site. So sometimes this can vary so much that you can't even really discern the original BTG. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about these kinds of units. This is kind of the baseline that we're working with. Alright, so jumping to the map to show a kind of overall projection of the Russian forces that are currently deployed. Now, I feel the need, as many intel analysts do feel sometimes, to put a lot of caveats on what I'm about to show because this is very, very significant if this is in fact true. The units that I'm about to show are from Ukrainian estimates that are as of November, but I'll show you the product they came from here in just a second. But these Ukrainian estimates look something like this. Now, for those of you who are familiar with military structures and the operational terms and graphics, this slide should make you slightly queasy because that's a lot of men. That is an extremely large amount of forces that are spread all the way around Ukraine. Now, again, I do want to kind of caveat again that much of that comes from this particular slide that has been widely circulated by your average OSINT analyst to your mainstream media alike. This slide was taken from a larger series of slides from the Ukrainian government as of last November, and it's a combination of actual units and projected units. So this might be a little bit misleading because we can't actually sit here and independently verify that all of these armies and brigades and divisions are where they are, right? We can't verify that. So this is, of course, again, coming from the Ukrainians. Now, I should also mention that if there's anybody who has the motive to overestimate Russia's, forces that are on their border, it would be Ukraine, right? Because so there is an element of, well, how much do you trust Ukrainian intelligence? And I don't know, from my very, very limited experience working in this kind of area and doing a lot of research, from what I've been able to tell, the Ukrainian intelligence is pretty spot on, and it's very close to what U.S. intelligence estimates are. So sorry, I can't give you more than just hey, trust the Ukrainian intelligence, but unfortunately our own internal estimates are actually quite a bit worse. So this is what we have estimated being used in the theater within at least the next couple of weeks. Some of this is confirmed. These units are confirmed to be in these locations. Other places, other units are not. So we'll get into this when we talk about when we go to each front here in just a minute. But right now, the official U.S. government estimates that have been either leaked or intentionally released to the press are that roughly 60 BTGs are right now on the border or are maneuvering to the border with Ukraine, either in Belarus or Russia proper. Now, from what we've been able to tell, that's a very low-ball estimate. So we've seen Ukrainian sources and a lot of other open-source sources thinking that maybe that number's around 80. So we're talking maybe 60 to 80 BTGs online right now. Now, as far as what's the magic number, a lot of people in the intel world think that the magic number is 100. So when Russia gets about 100 BTGs online and ready to roll, that's when they're going to start rolling across the countryside. But again, that's just speculation. A lot of this is just guesswork when it comes to a lot of the intel work that's being done by us and by others as well. Some of the big dog additions that the Ukrainian slides and the Ukrainian intelligence products have not had, but we have observed being in the area, roughly in these positions actually, are the S-400 ADA detachments and battalions. Now, this is a big deal. These are very high level, very sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems, and that's roughly where they're located. But again, we can talk more about that when we get into it a little bit later. We also, as of this morning, were able to confirm one BM-27 Uragan MRLS battalion being in that area. Maybe a division. Don't really know just yet, but I guess we'll have to see. And then also, in addition to that, we also have the Russian government actually doing us a favor and confirming that they are sending 25 Su-35 fighter aircraft and all related support equipment and vehicles to Belarus in that deployment. Now, it is important to note that Russia and Belarus have half-heartedly declared that they are simply conducting a training exercise. That's the reason for all of this deployment. And I say that that's a half-hearted defense because that excuse is almost certainly a joke, honestly, because most of the deployments that have been confirmed by local sources have not been anywhere near the declared training areas for this exercise, right? And most of the units that have been observed are not officially a part of these so-called exercises. So it's kind of a farce to say that this is an exercise. It's kind of a half-hearted attempt. So the softball assessment is that, of course, Russia and Belarus are using this exercise as an excuse to get men and equipment closer and closer to the border without NATO doing too much. We're also hearing rumors via the social media accounts of Russian soldiers that are actually being deployed for this, that Russia has left their conscripts behind. So they will not be taking part in these quote-unquote exercises, right? Now, this is a big deal because conscripts are a really large part of Russian military doctrine. Russia, a while back after the fall of the Soviet Union, wanted to go with a more volunteer. They wanted to go with an all-volunteer army, but that wasn't possible. Not enough people were volunteering for military service because the Russian military is kind of it's a very tough organization, I should say that. And it's not very popular. People didn't really want to join it. So Russia has kind of had to go with this hybrid sphere of having volunteers run a lot of the more sophisticated equipment and be in more of the elite units, whereas conscripts being deployed as basically just support roles and things like that. Now, you'd think that it would be the other way around. You'd think that the conscripts would be basically cannon fodder. Well, that's not the way it's worked out, because the political leadership in Russia, Vladimir Putin specifically, has been very hyper attentive to this to make sure that the Russian people and the Russian public doesn't the Russian public really does not like it when conscripts get killed in action. So it looks much better in the papers if any combat deaths that are seen are from volunteers. So that's something that the Russian government has most certainly been hyper attentive to. But again, they've left their conscripts behind for this deployment, which points even more to this not being a training exercise, because if it was a training exercise, you'd bring your conscripts along, but you don't want your conscripts to get killed in any frontline fighting, because that just brings morale down within Russia. Alright, so let's talk scheme of maneuver for a bit. The general theory of maneuver is going to be as follows. And this is not our assessment, this is really just a culmination of assessments from a lot of different organizations and people who have been talking about Ukraine for a very long time. There are a lot of assumptions being made about the Russian way of war and what's going to be done and whatnot. I'm just going to give you the very broad brushstrokes of what is roughly the theory as to what's going to happen. Most people think that there's going to be a northern and southern push along several fronts. So, and this can happen in different orders, but most likely we're going to see a push from the east to the Dnieper River really early on, in conjunction with a push from the south up through Crimea. We're also expecting a push from the north through Kharkiv all the way down, and also a concerted push for Kiev. Additionally, forces stationed in Moldova, in the essentially what's a Russian puppet state, they can provide supporting roles. They can provide locations for staging things like radar and electronic warfare and stuff like that. We're not really going to see too many troops being deployed from Moldova, or too many Russian troops being staged there, but this will be yet another front that the Ukrainians will have to fight on if it comes to that. My guess is that they're probably going to hold off on using Moldova as a base until they see how the rest of this goes. Additionally, from the northwest, we're going to see most likely a lot of airborne units being staged in Belarus for taking out or securing various targets. Again, airborne's mission, especially in the Russian concept, is to land in areas without transiting over the land, right? So parachute down into areas to hold and secure a specific objective until the land forces can come and support that role as well. So we might see airborne units being used all over Ukraine to secure various airfields. There's a lot of airfields in the west that are still being used, so we might see that occur as a way to prevent the Ukrainian Air Force, what's left of it, from ever getting off the ground in the first place. We're also going to see significant dominance in the form of aerial superiority being used to blanket Ukraine to make sure that not even a paper airplane gets off the ground. So moving down to the specific Eastern Front as we see it right now, this is the incursion zone. This is where the invasion has already occurred. Like I mentioned, Donetsk, the Donbass area, Luhansk, really is where the front line is. You can see that red line that shows where the current front line is. as of, well, right now. Now we have EW platforms being templated. Again, I should mention that this is all speculative. We don't really know where these EW units are, but it will be fairly easy to find them because the Russians have been very, very, very instrumental in developing the field of electronic warfare. The Russians have put a lot of time and effort into developing out their electronic warfare capabilities and using that in war. And we have seen EW units, very large, significant EW units, being used in years past roughly where these units are templated now. So we're just going to assume that they're there for now, and once we get a better location for it, we'll update you there. As far as other units goes, we don't really have any specific locations just yet, but again, we'll update you on that. Moving down to the Crimean front, the Southern Front. This is, of course, where the Crimean incursion / invasion has already occurred. Now let's talk amphibious stuff for a minute. Now, the 6 ships that are inbound from the Baltic / North Sea fleets, they are most likely, a lot of people are thinking that Odessa is going to be a major target. Odessa is a major port town, significant cargo offloading capacity in Odessa. It will be a great place for an amphibious landing somewhere around there so that they can use those amphibious troops to hold the city for the Crimean soldiers to come across and take that as well and support that. So I don't know if that's going to be the goal. I think that it's kind of, who knows, this might be all trickery. We might see them being dropped up in the Azov uplands. You never really know until it happens, I suppose. Remember, the Russians are masters of military deception. They call it maskirovka, right? So they, like the Chinese, are very instrumental in the field of military deception. The Russians are as well. Once we get a better idea of where these ships are going to be located, we'll template them there. They're not there yet. They're not in the Black Sea yet. They just passed through the English Channel this morning. So again, we'll figure that out once we figure out where they're going. They might stop at Sevastopol in Crimea and onload some troops. We don't really know if troops have been onloaded already. It would be kind of an unpleasant journey if these guys were already loaded on board and they're sailing halfway around the world just to get to this location. But I guess we'll see how that works out. In either case, we'll have pictures of these guys going through the Turkish Straits to get up to the Black Sea anyway. Moving up to the Northeastern Front, we don't really have too much templated just yet. This is kind of a blank map. We'll have to wait and see where these units actually pop up, but I can tell you that most of the staging activity that we have seen, either people recording videos of trains unloading or offloading or stuff like that, that's going to be in Bryansk. So that's where a significant portion of troops are being staged, presumably for the northern thrust for Kiev. And sidestepping a little bit to cover the Belarusian border, this is the Northwestern Front. Like I mentioned, significant more intelligence on this front so far because we've been able to just pick up a lot more information from Belarusian media. So the first big addition is really the first MRLS unit that we have seen move really close to the border. Really, they're somewhere in the Gomel region. We haven't been able to specifically geolocate them down to a specific lat long yet, but we were able to identify them as the 165th Artillery Brigade. So that's the flash that we'll use on them for now. There is also at least one BTG in the town of Yeltsk, Belarus. A local TV station actually went out and interviewed the guys, so we'll have to follow back up on that. But that is very, very close to the Ukrainian border. So that's all we have for the fronts this time. We'll continue using this format depending on how things go. Again, this may all be a farce. We might just be fooled again and Russia decides to pull out and not launch the invasion this time due to the weather. Who knows? But whatever happens, we'll let you know what goes on. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.